Hi, welcome to the second installment of the Country Girls Sew Along. It is part of the continuing Lessons with Laura series. If you're new here, my name is Laura Ingalls Gunn. Last week we had the first video in the series, and that covered which pattern to select, fabrics that work well, pattern preparation as well as layout, and then we actually cut out our pattern pieces. So now today we're ready to start sewing. We're now going to get ready to alter one of the pattern pieces a second time. But I wanted to show you what it is going to look like. So this is the Mary Ingalls dress that is part of the Little House 50th anniversary costume collection that I created. And if you want to know more about that, I have a really lengthy post on my website, and I'll link down to that below. But you can see that the pattern has been altered. It doesn't have a zipper. And in order to make this work, it's just a really simple technique in terms of where you attach the skirt. It's just a little bit shorter for the overlap so that when it comes together, when it is buttoned, then it is, well, I guess the word might be seamless. So we are going to cut one side of the two back bodice pieces, and it will line up where the original pattern piece is supposed to be cut if you were installing the zipper. And again, if you're using the zipper, that's great too. You'll just go ahead and follow the step-by-step instructions. I will not be covering an installation of the zipper, but there's many wonderful YouTube videos that can show you that technique. So I'm going to go ahead and set up the camera in another position. I'll be doing some of the work on my ironing board. I use it quite often as a cutting table. I'm sure those of you who've been sewing a bit also do the same. But let's go over and get started with the cutting of that first piece. As you recall last week, when we cut out our two bodice back pieces, which was pattern number 2, I extended the pattern piece by 1.5 inches, and you can see that I gave myself a reminder to do that. Now I am going to take my pins out, and on this pattern piece we actually only need one of the two pattern pieces extended. Okay, so we have two back pieces, and that is very similar to what Mary's dress was. There was two back bodice pieces, and it's only the right hand side that needs the extension. So this is the pattern piece, the right hand side, that we will keep just as we cut it. We altered it by 1.5 inches, and we cut it so that it was longer, it was wider. So I am going to set this piece to the side, and then this piece we are actually going to reattach the pattern piece and cut it along the original. And you'll hear that my air conditioning just popped up. If for any reason you have a hard time hearing me, you can click on the CC button down below, and that will provide closed captioning. All right, So we have it repinned again. We don't need the extension piece. And oh my goodness, between dogs, well, we're just gonna soldier on because I wanna try and get as much of this sewn and filmed as I possibly can today in order to get the video up on time next week. Okay, so that is our left-hand side pattern piece. Now, could I have, when I originally was laying out the pattern pieces, could I have just cut them separately? I could have. For me, there's just less of a chance for error in doing it this way. So now that we have our pieces, we are going to read the first set of instructions. These are the instructions that come with the pattern. And you may have remembered on the first page is the pattern layout. So if you flip it over, it says to stay stitch the bodice front and bodice back neck edges 1/2 from the cutting edge. So why do we do that? Well, I'm wearing a blouse with a curved neckline. If I had not added stay stitching to it while I'm wearing it, even sewing it, washing it, it could lose its shape. But by adding that stay stitching, it will help it retain its nice rounded shape. And so I know a lot of people want to bypass stay stitching. They figure it's an unnecessary step. But again, stopping to iron, doing your stay stitching, all those little fiddly bits in sewing that people think, oh, I'm just gonna skip over. Those are the slow steps that really take your garment from being ho-hum to wow, just having a great fit, looking professional. And so we are going to do the stay stitching. I have my sewing machine all ready to go with thread, a fresh new needle, and this is bodice front, piece 1. So we're just gonna set that aside. And then this is the neckline. Now that you have it opened there, can you kind of see that this is the neckline? And this is what it wants us to stay stitch. So they say 1/2 inch. I'm just going to use the side of my sewing machine foot as a guide, and it's just a regular straight stitch. So I'm going to go forward 1 or 2 times, and then I'm going to push the backwards button, and then that just will help keep the stitching in place. Turn to follow that neckline. And again, there's no rush, there's no race. So we're just going to gently manipulate and shift our fabric. Now on mine, you can adjust the speed setting of how fast you can stitch. So if you're a beginner, you can go as slow as you want. Now, because I've been sewing for a while, I know how to control my machine. And then when we get to the end, we're just gonna backstitch again. Now, my backstitch button is right here. Yours might be somewhere else. And then I always go ahead and trim and dispose of my threads. So you might have a hard time seeing it because again, I chose thread that will give me an invisible look. Let's see if you can see it a little bit better on the back. I think so. And so now we're going to repeat the process on the 2 back bodice pieces. And so that's why I needed to trim off this piece because I didn't need that neckline to be as long as it is on this side, because when we're finished, this is going to go over. So this is why this piece needed to be longer. So since it's basically in essence the same process, I'm not going to film this. I want to save my battery. We've done all our stay stitching, so we're going to move on to number 2. And that is to make the darts in the bodice front and the bodice back section. And if you remember in last week's video, this is where the dart indicators are, and I showed you how to make those markings. And so now this is our bodice back. What I do is I start at the very top, and you can see right here where the very end of the dart will be. So I kind of fold my fabric in half, and I take my pin and I indicate that that's where that's going to be the end, and I'm going to stop stitching there. And then I just sort of work my way down, and your goal is you folded the fabric over, but you want the darts, the lines of the darts, to match up. Can you kind of see that? So again, I'm just going to carefully pin that in place, and I'm just working my way down. Okay, see? Now I need to readjust how that's folded because that's not correct. So let's readjust the fold. You know, sewing is a little bit fiddly. Some people don't have the patience for it, and I understand that. Okay, so this is probably the last pin. All right, a little bit, we're almost there. Perfect, perfect. Okay, so that's kind of how I do my pins. And I'm gonna start stitching on the bottom, and I will be doing a back stitch. And then when I get to the end, I'm not going to back stitch. And the reason why is when you're sewing darts, if you back stitch there, it could possibly pucker. So I'm going to leave the thread tails long, and you'll see what I mean in just a moment. And make sure you can see. So again, this is the bottom part of the bodice. I'm just going to line my foot up at the bottom. I'm just going to start stitching a couple of stitches, and then I'm going to hit the back stitch button, and then I'm just going to follow that line, removing my pins as I go. And the reason for that, why it's important to remove your pins as you sew, is if the needle comes in contact with a pin, your pin can get broken and lodged underneath in the mechanism, or your needle can break and go flying. So you just want to be careful. Okay, now we are getting close to where the stopping point is. Okay, so just for me, I'm just really slow and steady, and I just run off the edge. Okay, and you see me, I'm pulling the thread out, I'm taking my snips, and I'm leaving some thread tails on the edge of that. Okay, and then we're going to go back over to the board, the ironing board, and I'm going to show you what our next step is for the darts. We have our back bodice piece, and this is the bottom. This is where I started and I back stitched, and those threads I can snip off and throw in the trash. And then this is where we ended. This is where we ended, and I have my little thread tails, so I'm going to remove my pin. And so for this, we are actually going to want to take those two ends and tie them off in a knot. So I go 1, 2, and 3. And then those little tails, I'm just going to remove them with my scissors now. So we've sewn the dart into place. Can you kind of see that? And this is what it looks like in the front. And in terms of stripes, it's very, very challenging to get stripes to match up in the dart. That again goes back to last week when I recommended solid colors and floral calicos are really good. So with this, I know that my dart needs to be ironed flat, and looking at the instructions, I know that it is pressed back towards the edge. So I know this is my edge. So I'm going to press that dart towards the edge. And then I'm going to flip the piece over. And I'm going to make sure that that seam is completely pressed open. You see that? Okay. Now we get to repeat that process twice on the front bodice, and of course the other bodice back piece. Since it's the same process, I'm going to save my camera battery and then we'll move on to the next section. So on view A, which is what we're making, the third step is if you want to embellish the front of your dress in the center front, you can apply ribbon, lace, or other assorted trims. That is completely optional. Because you don't really see that treatment on Little House on the Prairie, that is why I'm opting not to do it. But by all means, if you would like to add those embellishments, absolutely go forth. And so moving on to number 4, it says stitch front to back at shoulder and side seams. So how they are showing it is that you will lay your fabrics on top of each other, right sides together, okay? And you'll sew right at the shoulder, the side seam, and the side seam. And that's just a straight stitch, making sure that you back stitch at the very start and at the very end. Now, I'm going to do a bit of a different technique. I'm going to do French seams. French seams create an entirely closed seam, so there's less of a chance for fraying when you wash your garment and wear it. And it just is a prettier look, in my opinion. So it looks nicer and it makes your garment more longer wearing. Okay, so I'm just going to pin one shoulder, and in order to achieve this, let's wait for a moment. Okay, in order to achieve a French seam, we put, oh my goodness. Okay, in order to achieve a French seam, we pin wrong sides together. So here I am, this is my shoulder seam, and I've pinned the wrong sides together. And I'm gonna stitch here, again following the edge of my sewing machine foot. So I'll come back in just a moment to show you our next step. Can you see the stitching? Let me see if once I take out my pins, okay, you can definitely see that I've stitched it, okay? So our very next step to creating a French seam, let me get these out so that they don't distract us, okay? So we're gonna put our garment flat on the ironing board, and here's that seam that I just have sewn. I'm gonna press that open. Now, if you don't want to do French seams, you will still press out all of your seams, and it would just look in reverse because of course you would sew your seam with the right sides together. After I have pressed out that seam, I'm gonna flip it over. And I'm gonna press the seam again. My goal is I'm trying to make this seam as flat as possible. And then I'm gonna pinch the fabric together right at that seam, okay? See how I've pinched it? And then I'm gonna lay it flat again. Okay, so let me show you again. We're taking that and we're lifting it up, okay? And we're pinching that seam. And then we're laying it down and pressing that seam. And I really give it a little bit of steam, and then I let it cool for just a second. Okay, and then by doing that, you can see that our seam where the raw edges has popped up. Okay, so then I'm going to go in there and I'm going to trim that down. So it's going to look like that. Do you see that? So then I'm going to grab my pins again, and I'm going to fold it back down. Now, in all honesty, I personally am not going to pin this. I would just take it to the sewing machine. But if you are a beginner, you do want to pin it. You want to pin it in place. For a shoulder seam, 3 pins is sufficient. So that's right on top. That's where that first seam is. Okay, so it looks like this. Now, I'm going to show you. This time, I'm going to reposition the camera so you can see me finishing that French seam. That first seam, I followed right along the edge of where my sewing machine foot was, and that's basically 3/8 of an inch. But this time, there is a little marker indicator, and it's going to be just past 1/8 of an inch. So it's going to be a very narrow seam when we're finished. And so you may want to just do the regular 5/8 seam that they show in the instructions. But if you would want an enclosed French seam, this is how you do it. So again, we're starting, and I hit my back stitch button. And sometimes, you know, this is an old girl, sometimes she gets a little fiddly, so I just have to manipulate the fabric to get her going. taking out my pins as I go along. We're getting to the end, so I'm going to hit the back stitch button. Okay. And then I am trimming off my thread tails. All right. So that makes a beautiful enclosed seam. For me, it feels nicer wearing this. It looks nicer. And then when you start washing and drying this, fabric has a tendency to fray. An enclosed seam, such as a French seam, ensures that that won't happen. So now I have to repeat the process on the other shoulder, on this side, as well as the side seams. I did want to show you that this is the front of my bodice. This is the back bodice piece. I am going to press that seam. Oh my goodness, I'm trying to get this to line up. This is the challenge when you're filming. Okay, I'm going to press that towards the back of the bodice. Okay, I'm pressing that seam. I'm flipping it over and pressing that seam. Okay, so then it lies really nice and smooth. So once I finish stitching, then I'll put it on my child-sized dress form because we will celebrate a small victory. You guys, let's get excited. This is starting to look like a dress. Oh my gosh. So let us look at what we've done so far. Okay, so that's our bodice. And then let me put it back on the mannequin. Now this mannequin is for like an 8-year-old child. I'm making this for a 10-year-old child. So it's a little small, but this is going to be our button back opening here. And so on the inside, here's all of our French seams, and even on the side, I did French seaming and I pressed it back towards the back. And so it is starting to look like a dress. Yay! Victory! We have completed step 4, that was sewing our bodice, and now we're going to move on to step 5, which is constructing the sleeve. And so that is pattern piece 4. And the very first thing that I want to do is there's a dart right here. And you can see that in last week's video, I made my markings on the inside there. So going back to just like how we did our darts in the bodice, I'm going to finish these darts. And then after that, it says to gather the top. So I'm going to come back when we get to that point to show you exactly how we will do a gathering stitch. So this is my sleeve piece, and you can see that I have sewn my dart and I've pressed it down. Okay, so it looks like this. This is going to give us the fit for the elbow area, if you're wondering why we added that dart. So the instructions say to run a long gathering stitch in between the notches, and we talked about notches last week. So there's a notch here, and you're going to go, this is called the sleeve head. This is the top of the sleeve. So here is the other smaller notch here. Now gathering stitches are different in that you use a long stitch not a sewing stitch. And so on my machine, let me adjust a little bit here so you can see. Okay, so right here I have it on 5.0, so that's going to be a long stitch. When I'm sewing, I normally have it on a stitch length of 2.6. So you'll need to find the longest stitch on your machine. All right, let's readjust the camera. And I set it up so that my first row of gathering stitches is going to be right around just over past 1/8 from the edge of the fabric. And we're not going to back stitch. For gathering stitches, we need to be able to pull those. So we're just going to go all around the top of this sleeve head until we get to the other notch. Okay, and again, we aren't back stitching. We're also going to pull it out a little bit before we snip, because then that will allow us to pull to start gathering the fabric. But before we do that, I like to do 2 rows of gathering stitches. That way if one thread breaks, you have a backup, but it also then gathers your fabric really beautifully together. And you're not going to be able to see these stitches because this next one was about 3/8 of an inch from the edge of the fabric. Again, we're pulling it out so that we have some thread tails and then snipping. Okay, so we've done 2 rows of gathering stitches at the top of the sleeve head between the notches. And then where the magic comes is on the front side, you're going to grab those 2 tails. And so then that starts gathering your fabric. We're not to that point yet, but that's what's going to create where your shoulder is going to go. It creates that volume of fabric where your shoulder will be. So we're going to smooth it out for right now, and then I have to do the same technique on the other sleeve, and then we're going to do something fun. On our sleeve, we've done our dart, we've ran our gathering stitches. Now, for those of you who just want to do a regular seam, the next step is that you'll fold the sleeve in half and you'll stitch up this long seam. I'm not quite ready to do that yet because I want to add a little pretty detail right along the edge of my sleeve. I want to do a little bit of lace, and I want to do a bit of grosgrain. Isn't that going to be pretty? So I want to do that while my fabric is still flat. Now I want that right along the edge. So I'm going to make a mark. On this particular pattern, the seam allowance is 5/8, and this is a seam gauge. We had talked about it in last week's video. So I'm just going to put my fabric right side down, and I'm going to take my seam gauge, I'm going to flip it up to 5/8. That's where eventually we're going to make a hem. Ooh, my iron is nice and hot, isn't it? I also just refilled it with water. Okay. So this is going to be my hem. Okay. This is going to be my indicator. And then I'm going to go ahead and, just for funsies, while my fabric is still flat, where we've made that, I'm going to tuck it in to create a finished edge. What do I mean by that? So this is the area that we just folded up, and then I went back and I tucked that edge in and I pressed it. So then the raw edge, which is right there, is now going to be enclosed. Okay, so we'll keep doing it. So there's our raw edge, and we're going to tuck it to where that pressed line is. Okay, and we're going to take our iron again, press over it, and then that raw edge, we're going to take it down to meet that first pressed edge line. Okay. And then go over it again. Okay, so then that is going to be the sleeve hem. Okay, so that's now going to be the edge of our sleeve. Now you're probably like, aren't you going to stitch that closed? Yes, I am, but in a tricky way. So I'm going to come over here. Now, I have to decide, you know, how do I want to place that lace? Do I want it right on the edge? Sometimes, because this is a children's garment, sometimes lace is itchy to children. And so if I have it hanging down below, that might rub their skin, and their skin's a little bit more sensitive than ours. I think in this case, I'm gonna place the edge of this lace right along the finished edge. Okay, so I'm gonna start pinning that in place. And so by doing this, when I stitch it down, it's also going to hem my sleeve at the same time. Okay? Because I'm gonna sew pretty close to this edge right here, because I don't want this flipping up, being bothersome. So I'm gonna stitch pretty close. So at the same time, that's gonna hem my sleeve. And I'm just gonna double check where I've pinned it to make sure everything is even. Taking that moment just to double check your work. That's what's going to make your garment look really professionally finished. Okay, so I'm happy with that. Now I'm going to leave a little bit of a lace tail. Okay, so I'm just going to stitch along here, and then we'll come back and I'll show you the next step. So we've attached our lace, and you can kind of see at the same time, I've also finished the hem of my sleeve. Now I'm gonna put it flat back on the ironing board, and now I'm actually gonna add a second bit of embellishment. During the Victorian era, oh, they loved to add embellishments. And it wasn't just to adult clothing that they did this. You know, children's clothing would be very heavily embellished with ribbons and bows and trim and pleating. Now, for somebody growing up on the pioneer trail, they needed their garments to be more durable. So this is still a pretty trim, but when you wash it, it's going to wash up nicely. It's not going to take a lot of time to iron this out. So I'm going to stitch it right along this edge, and then I'm going to stitch it right along that edge. So 2 rows of stitching. Again, at this edge, I'm going to reverse to make sure my sewing stitches stay in place, and then we'll be ready to stitch up that side seam. Won't that be a pretty sleeve? Just a nice little delicate accent. So I have attached the first sleeve to the bodice. I think it's looking really pretty. And I'll just kind of show you some of the details. So that is the sleeve head, okay? And that's where those gathering stitches that we sewed in, they were pulled up to the top of the sleeve head. And then on the bottom, the seams line up where the sleeve meets the bodice. So on the inside, let me show you. I sewed the sleeve up with a French seam, just like same technique that I used on the bodice. And then it was just a straight stitch. I will be finishing this edge with my serger. You can also cut it with pinking shears or do a zigzag stitch on the edge. But you see how I've matched up those notches? That's what we're gonna do. That's what I'm gonna show you. And these are the bigger notches on this side. When I'm getting ready to attach the sleeve, if it is a basic sleeve design similar to this, I like to lay it flat and give it a good pressing. So this is going to be the top of our sleeve head. And you see that by pressing that, it makes the pressing mark. So that's the top of our sleeve. That, of course, is our bottom. And so then I'm going to grab my bodice. Everybody probably has a different way of attaching sleeves. And I'm going to tell you right now, they can be tricky. There is a reason that in the sewing community, they are called sleevells, because sleeves can be evil. So I'm just going to repress this seam on the bodice. We want to make sure that the seam is headed towards the back. Okay, so like that. There's our armhole. Now, I'm first going to take it, and right where that bodice side seam is, that's where I'm going to pin it to this bottom seam of the sleeve. So we're going to join those seams together. Okay, and I'm going to show you in just a second. So I'm going to run a pin horizontally. So it's going to look like that, and this is why I do that. Okay, because then I flip open to where the sleeve is meeting the bodice, and I double check that the seam here and here is in alignment. So it almost will look like one continuous seam. So it looks good. So then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna put in on either side of the seam a set of vertical pins, and I'll show you what I mean in a minute. So just like this, and the reason that I do that is now it won't move even while I'm sewing. So that is my insurance that my seams will stay in alignment. Now the second area that I focus on is I'm looking at the top of the bodice where the shoulder seam is, okay? So I'm kind of going to take that area that we pressed, the top of that sleeve head. We're going to pretend that that pressed area is a seam. So in much the same way, we're going to make sure that that press seam indicator and then this shoulder seam at the top, they're all in alignment. And then that's when we can start and lining up the notches, okay? And I can kind of tell that there's going to be excess fabric. So that's where our gathering stitches come in. So I'm just going to grab both of those tails and gently start pulling and kind of just guiding them along to the top of that sleeve area. And then I'm going to sort of see, oh yeah, everything is lining up now. So I can then proceed to take my pins and start pinning those two edges together, right sides together, and I might have to, it's called stroking the gathers, to get them exactly where I want them to be, that they're evenly spaced, there's no bunching. So again, we're just going to continue to keep working those pins and fabric. So I have one side done. Now I'm going to flip around. Okay, these two notches, the smaller notches, they go together. Okay. I'm going to pin that. Make sure this edge close to our bottom bodice seam is good. And then here again, we've got some excess fabric that we need to gather up. So we're going to just start pulling these threads and pushing the gathered fabric up. Pulling the threads, gathered fabric up. And then, okay, that looks great. That's enough gathering. So we can continue with our pinning. Continue with our pinning. Oh, Gracie the Dachshund's at the door. She wants in probably. Come on in, sweet girl. Come on in. Okay. Keep smoothing and manipulating that fabric. And then I'm going to kind of look. Okay, my gathers aren't even. So I'm going to unpin. And then I'm just going to make sure, just going to manipulate them, work them so that everything looks nicely spaced apart. There's just a nice distribution of the gathers. And then I'm going to repin. Okay, whoopsie. All right. And add that pin. Okay, so now we are ready to go attach this at the sewing machine. My sewing machine, there's a section that then can be removed so that the base is much more narrow. And the reason why that is helpful is because if you have a small sleeve head, like, and a small armhole area, that's gonna help you get it into position more easily. Now, when I'm doing my sleeves, I don't use the back stitch button when I'm first starting out because there might be a little bit of an adjustment in the seam area if our seams don't end up matching. So I want this to be able to come out easily if we need it. And then, let's see, let's make sure, okay, that's at the top of the sleeve head. Good thing I double checked. Okay, here we go. Alright, sometimes I accidentally pin on the wrong side, so then I have to adjust, and that's okay. Alright, so we are ready. So again, I'm not going to back up, and I'm using the 5/8 seam allowance, which is the standard seam allowance for most of your Simplicity, McCall's, and Butterick patterns. And I'm going to move my pins closely by. Because sleeves are so fiddly, I go really slowly. You know, you're sewing on a curve, basically. So, and then we're getting to the gathered area, so I'm just checking everything's in alignment. But it is the sleeve area that I most often have to pick out and use my seam ripper. Sometimes I have to set a sleeve, which is the process that we're doing right now. I recently set a sleeve 6 times before I got it correctly into the position. Now, it was a historical sleeve from the 17th century, which I think, if there's other historical seamstresses, you can give your opinion. In my opinion, those are the worst sleeves to set. Okay, so we're kind of manipulating fabric, slow and steady. Okay. Repositioning the fabric if we need to. Sewing, I know some of the competitions that you've seen, Project Runway, sewing, good sewing. Sewing, creating a garment you're going to be proud of, it's not a race by any means. Okay, so I'm already having an issue right here of puckering, so I'm going to stop sewing. And I'm going to see what is going on. Why is this puckering? So I'm going to stop sewing. Okay. Figuring it out. Might just be the positioning of fabric. So I'm going to look at it again. Okay. Everything is still in alignment. It might have just been sewing on that curve is not easy. So we're just gonna soldier on. We're almost there. We're almost to the end of this sleeve. Whoopsie, there goes my pins. Okay, that's what I get for sticking them up there. Now, everything ended up lining up beautifully. We're good to go. So I am going to use my back stitch button to secure this seam. And now I'm going to go through, I'm going to trim these tails, the little thread tails. Okay. Look, here's some more thread tails when I had to stop and start again. You know, sewing is patience. Oh, I see what has happened. Okay, you know what? I'm glad this happened because the reason why I was having trouble is because I accidentally caught my fabric. Do you see that? Okay, seam ripper time. So I'm gonna take this, I'm just gonna, the stitches that are incorrect, I'm gonna take those out. This is good. You know, we all, sewing requires patience and perseverance, I think is another good word for what you need. And so then I'm going to go ahead and look at it from this angle. Okay, now sometimes that happens with gathered areas. You know, you just inadvertently catch the wrong area of fabric. So then I'm going to put it back under here. Okay. I knew that there was something wrong, I just couldn't see it. So sometimes it will be revealed. Okay. So just restitched that area, making sure that I backstitched so that it'll be a nice sturdy seam. Okay, so then I'm just going to go around and I want to make sure there's no puckering, and we can go ahead and trim the gathering stitch threads. You can also pull them all the way out if you would like to. Okay, so we're just going to go and check all the way around the perimeter. That looks good on this side. Okay, but the proof is here. And I start in the armpit area. Okay, did my seam align? And it's a little bit of a challenge to see because it's a diagonal fabric, but it did indeed. So I'm happy about that. And then I just want to make sure, do the gathers look evenly spaced at the top of the sleeve head? This is a good sleeve installation. I'm really happy. So we have just finished the sleeves and we are now on step 8. And right at the front of the V of the skirt, they want us to reinforce the skirt front. So in essence, it's stay stitching along the skirt front, and they want us to do this on 1 inch of either side of the small dot, and then clip the seam allowance to the stitching. What does that mean? I'm going to tell you. As soon as I can find my seam ripper, I spend half my time looking for sewing tools. Okay, let's look at the pattern piece first. So this is our skirt front. It is number 5. Do you see that little indicator right there? Okay, so let's measure it And sure enough, it's down 5/8 of an inch, which is the sewing seam allowance. So I have already marked it, but just on one side, not through the double thicknesses. Okay, so we're gonna set the pattern aside, and then we're gonna open this to a single thickness, okay? So this is, again, there's a pressing line, so that tells us right where the center is. I'm actually, just for good measure, I'm also gonna put a pin in there, so I remember to pivot a bit. And I know some of you are chuckling because you're thinking about Ross pivoting with his couch. Same concept. Okay, so 5/8. They want us to sew an inch on either side, so we're gonna go ahead. We're gonna sew a bit, back stitch, and then we're gonna go right to where that center pin is. Okay. Then pivot a little bit. So we do that by lifting up our sewing machine foot. But before we do that, we want to make sure that the needle is in the down position. So this is needle up, that's needle down, and I'm doing that by twisting. Let me just show you. Can you see me turning? This is the wheel right there, okay? So we've pivoted, and now we're gonna go back to this side like 1 inch, okay? All right, now this is gonna help us get that nice crisp V on the front of our bodice. It just helps. And what they're saying is they want us to clip. So I'm just gonna do that, and then I'll show you guys what it looks like. Okay, so you see the stitching on either side? Let me see if I can catch the light. And then we clipped it just a little bit, stopping shorter than where the seam is going to be. Okay, and now the next thing they want us to do is to sew the skirt panels together. So let me take you over to the ironing board to show you how we're gonna set that up. This is the front of the skirt portion of our dress. This is right where we've just sewn, and you can see the little clip mark. So if you're gonna sew just regular seams, you will take your back skirt panel and lie it on top, and then there's all along the side. You'll start making sure that your notches match, and you'll pin all along this side. I got cut off because my SD card was full, so I had to stop and download the videos I've made so far to empty it out. Okay, so where I was sharing that I personally am going to do French seams on my skirt. So for that, I am going to pin wrong sides together, because if you remember from when I did the French seam on the shoulder and bodice areas, it creates an enclosed seam, but it's a two-part process. So I am just going to finish this, and then I hope to get it attached to the bodice, because it is standard practice that before hemming a skirt, you generally let it hang after it's been attached to the bodice for about 24 hours. And that is because sometimes fabrics shift or stretch, and if that occurs and you've already hemmed it, then your skirt is going to be lopsided. I'm back on my kitchen counter because I wanted you to see the layout of the skirt. Now, if you were paying attention to the layout as well as the pattern pieces for the skirt front, you were to cut one on the fold. And so you can see this was our fold right here. This is where it dips down, and we did the reinforcing stitch. Okay, so that's our center piece. And then on the skirt back and skirt side, you were supposed to cut two on the fold. And so this one piece gets joined to the center skirt front, okay? And then you were to cut a second one again, and that gets joined to the other side. So it's a lot of fabric, which is why I set it up here. But again, you're gonna put your front piece, and then this becomes the side and the back. And then I'm just now getting ready to attach the other skirt side and back to the other side of the skirt front. So you have three separate panels that you're joining together. I hope that makes sense. I'm back on the long kitchen counter. This is the three skirt panels all stitched together and folded in half. And this is a girl's size 10. It is a lot of fabric. So zooming in, this is the center front where we reinforced, and we're going to attach the V of the bodice. And you'll see here, let me flip it over, I've run gathering stitches all along here, all along the edge, stopping at the seams. So you see the gathering stitches all along here. And then this is the back center seam. So I did French seaming on the side seams, but of course you can't do a French seam on the back because it has to be, part of the skirt has to be opened. So for that, you know, I just stitched it up in a normal seam, looks like that, and then I took my serger to the edges so it doesn't fray. Now, there's one other step that I want to show you. So this is, again, this is the back seam. This is where we're going to attach it to the bodice. Because I have made adjustments to put a button back instead of a zipper back, I went ahead, can you see this? I've just sewed a stitch all along the edge, reinforcing. Let's see if the camera will. So I reinforced down at the bottom where it ends, and then all the way up above. Why do we want to do that? Well, number one, we want the skirt panel to set smoothly. Number two, because this is a children's dress and they might be a little bit rougher getting it on and off of their head, this helps reinforce so that the seam doesn't get ripped off. In terms of the bodice and the button back closure, I just wanted to show you how the extension looks. So on the left-hand side, this is your basic 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And so if you're doing the zipper, you would just have that regular bodice piece on both sides, and then the zipper would be right up in front. So I did use my serger on that edge, and then I'm gonna sew that down so it doesn't flap at all. Now, on the extension piece, I also serged that end, although it wasn't really necessary. And then remember this was an 1.5 inch extension. So that's the measurement that I folded it and pressed it down. And then once that's in place, I fold it down again. That just adds extra support for the buttons. And so when I go to attach the skirt pieces, this edge is all finished. And then I'll add the buttonholes in a little bit. I have pinned the bodice to the skirt. If you look at it on the inside, it's all gathered. So now I'm just going to do a 5/8 seam allowance stitch all the way around. And there's our Grace. Gracie, be quiet. Okay, so we now have successfully sewed the bodice to the skirt. You can see all the gathering. So now we're just going to let it hang overnight to let things settle. Let me turn the mannequin around so we can look at the back. So on the right hand side, I leave the 5/8 seam allowance open on the waistband, and that is where I then start with the skirt. This side, it all lines up. So what will happen is then when it's buttoned, it'll be smooth and nicely joined. I do need to fix the gathers. For some reason that wasn't what I was wanting. I wanted it to be gathered through here. So I just have to open up this seam, shift it over a little bit so that then when it's shut, it looks pretty seamless. All the way back up. And then tomorrow we'll add on the collar. It will also have some of the same trim buttons. So I need to look for buttons tonight. Yes, it is almost 9 o'clock, so I've been sewing for 8 hours. Again, a lot of that was setting up the camera. I did stop to have dinner and chase after the ice cream lady. So all told, I probably sewed about 6.5 hours. Okay, so on the back, I readjusted the gathers so that they're more evenly spaced, closer to the edge, so that when we add in our buttons, it gives a more seamless look. Now, I also like to share what I call the guts of the project. Because if you can see the actual construction, I think that's helpful. You know, when we see something from here, it's like, okay, well, we know it's sewed, but you can really see my gathering stitches. You can see where I sewed it at 5/8 of an inch. And then to make sure it doesn't ravel, I've then run it through my serger. Now, you can also cut the edge with pinking shears, or you can do a little zigzag stitch. Some people also cover it with bias tape. It just depends on how much you want your garment to really last. When I make something like this, I am looking upon it as heirloom sewing. This will hopefully be a dress that is passed down and worn many times, which is very much what the pioneers did. So that's what my interior guts look like. On our instructions, we have finished attaching the skirt, and we have already prepared the back closure. If this is where you're at in terms of installing a zipper, you'll want to go ahead and do that now. So our next step is the collar. And we need to attach interfacing to the wrong side of one of the collars. And if we're going to add lace, we need to do that step. And then we're going to put the two pieces right sides together and stitch up the edges and turn it right side out to attach to the dress. So let's break that down. So this is our pattern piece. It's number 3. This is fusible interfacing, and you can see that I've cut the pattern piece out of it. You can get this at craft and sewing supply stores. It comes in different weight. And there's a smooth side, and then there's a little bit of a rough side. The rough side is what you are going to lay face down on the wrong side of your fabric. Okay, so this is the right side, wrong side, and I'm just gonna press this collar piece out smooth. And then what I normally do is I have it where I try to cut the interfacing a little bit smaller than the actual pattern piece. If not, if it overlaps, that is okay. It can just over time gum up your iron and cover a little bit. Okay, so it's pretty good. And we're just, I might have this a little bit too hot for this. Different brands of interfacing work differently, so I'm gonna flip this over and apply it that way. And there's a little bit of extra that I don't need, so I'll just trim those areas off. Again, that's me just trying to minimize, because when you activate it with heat, it can get a little gummy. So just smooth it down in the center. Okay, Okay, so now we have our interfaced piece, and you can kind of see with the interfacing, it just makes that collar a little bit sturdier. See how this droops? With interfacing, that fabric piece is a bit more sturdy. So that's why we add interfacing. Now, we have notches on either end of the piece. So I'm going to press out this piece right in the center. Needs a little bit of steam. Then this is where we're going to put right sides together. Okay. And again, just kind of fiddle with the fabric to get the ends where you need them to be. And then we're going to pin it because we're going to sew all along here and down. The notched edge we are going to leave open. Now, I take my pins at the corners where we're going to pivot, and I put it in directionally. And I will show you on the machine why I do this, because that is going to help you have the right seam allowance. Now, on this collar piece, sometimes they do a smaller sewing seam, but this is indeed still 5/8 of an inch. So we're just going to keep pinning, and then I'm going to take it over to the machine and show you how I sew it. Now I've decided that I want to add that same detail we put on the sleeves on the edge of my collar. So what I'm going to first do is I'm going to put right sides together just like that. Okay, I'm going to pin it. Now normally you're going to sew the collar on one side across and down, but since I want to decorate the uppermost edge of my collar, I'm just going to sew right across this top seam. So I'm going to take it over to the machine, and then I'll bring it back to show you what I mean. So I have sewn just along the top of the unnotched, these are our notches. So I sewed 5/8 of an inch along the top of the collar. Okay, so it basically looks like this. Now I'm going to press it open, the seam. I'm going to press the seam open like this, really applying pressure because I want that crisp, clean edge. Okay. And again, you're going to manipulate that fabric. And then I'm going to turn it over. And again, I'm going to press. Press it out, make sure there's no puckering. Okay. All right, now this is the side that has the interfacing in it, and normally I put that on the interior, and the reason that I do that is sometimes your interfacing can bubble once you've been washing it and wearing it for a while, So if it does that, then it's on the inside where nobody can see, and it's fine. And a lot of times if you just run a hot iron over that collar piece, the interfacing will be reactivated. Okay, so now that I've pressed that seam open, I'm getting it right on that edge and pressing it down. Okay, it's going to be our top collar edge. So in essence, that's going to be the top of our collar. So that's sewn. This is open because we have to apply this end to the dress. But what that then allows me to do is I know exactly then where my trims need to go. Okay. Right on that edge. And so I'm going to start pinning these down, and then I'll take it over to the sewing machine so you can see me stitch it. I use a lot of pins. I don't want it moving. That ribbon is right next to that seam line, and I have the interior seam going up, so I'm not going to be sewing on that interior seam. We'll be bypassing it. So I'm going to start my stitch right at the top here so that I can hold it in place. Okay. I have also, just real quick show you, I've also changed out my thread to red. Okay, now this one, this is something that I want to go start out, do the back stitch, and then I'm just going to go nice and slow. Okay, I'm going to take that first pin out, pin it sideways. I'm just right along that edge, making sure it's bumped up right at the seam, that the ribbon is bumped right at the seam. And this is pretty much how slow I go. Okay. Readjusting. And then, you know, when I say for a three-piece bustle dress, you know, why does it take you so long? Well, love lives in the details, and I'm very careful with my stitching. I love a pretty, well-made dress, and maybe the average person isn't going to notice that the stitching is straight, but I know. All right, we're getting there. So I'm just going to keep stitching, and then I'll come back and do this edge along the lace. So that is what our collar is now going to look like. And that's the back of it. So now what we need to do is sew up each end. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. And then we're going to attach it to the dress. So this is my collar. You can see the interfaced piece is right here. The uninterfaced piece I have attached right sides together to the bodice. Okay, and I like a lot of pins. It helps to evenly distribute the fullness. Okay, so I'm going to sew the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now, right at the top seam of the collar, you can see that I've clipped into it at regular intervals, and I did diagonal cut on the corners. So you can kind of see a little bit more that way. Okay, you see? And the reason I do that is when we flip this inside out, we don't want that bulk, because if we leave that there, the corner won't be as crisp. So that's why I've done this. So now I'm gonna stitch my collar to the edge of my dress, see? All right, so I have stitched the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and we now have that one edge attached to the bodice. And so now we have to flip out this corner. Okay, so we're doing that. It's kind of just like magic, and you finesse it a little bit. So I've already done this side, and then to get that corner out, you know, you may need to gently push it from the interior with your seam ripper, but be very careful. You don't want to rip it. Okay, so that's what it's going to look like. And next I'm going to show you how to finish the interior. This is called a tailor's ham, and it's definitely ham shaped. It's rounded, so it helps us in our ironing with curved seams. Okay, this is the exterior of our collar. It looks great. Now we still have all of this going on, so what I need to do is flip under the seam allowance, press it down, and pin it in place, and then I'll be hand stitching that closed. Okay, so I like to start in the center and work my way out. So just gonna start with a good press, let it cool a little bit, and then I'm gonna flip that seam. And sometimes there's a errant thread, so trim that up. Okay, and I am meeting the edge of that right where that stitching was, where we joined the collar to the bodice. Okay, and then I'm gonna start going down either edge, flipping it, bringing it to that edge we just stitched. Okay. So now there's room for a pin right along the edge. Okay, so pressing it down, nice and hot. Be careful, especially if children are doing this. You want to either iron it for them, or, you know, if it's an older child, 11, 12, with supervision. Okay, so again, we're pressing that edge down. And then, so this is our rough edge right here of where it meets at the end. And so we kind of just flip and tuck, okay? And again, manipulating that fabric. Here's another little piece of thread. I don't like any loose threads on my garments. Okay, that looks pretty good. So I'm gonna pin that. There's another little thread over here. If you clip threads as you go along, then it's not so overwhelming. I know a lot of people leave it to the end, but then you might miss a thread. Okay, so there we go. So now I'm going to go ahead and finish the other side, but let me show you this. So that's the end. So we've tucked in that edge and pressed it down and pinned it in place. And then I'm going to finish this side, and then we're going to hand stitch it down. Okay, so I wanted to show you everything's been pinned in place for me to hand stitch. But before I go in and start that, because I usually like to pop in a movie or a television show while I do that, I'm going to get my other area that needs to be hand stitched ready, and that's my skirt. So this is the back seam of my skirt. Okay, now I want, for me personally, a really deep hem on this, like a 6-inch hem. So I'm going to get my seam gauge. I'm going to measure out, your average seam gauge is 6 inches. Okay, and then I'm going to make sure that that lines up with that seam. I'm going to press that up. Okay, basically then I'm going to come over here, I'm going to measure, and sometimes we need to readjust. And I'm going to press that into place. Okay, we're going to pull it and smooth it, manipulate it to get it right where you want it, press into place. So we're going to go all the way around the circumference of the skirt. And then once we've done that, we're going to take our fabric and we're going to bring it, the raw edge, to where that pressed seam is. Can you see where the pressed seam is? And we're going to fold our fabric and then fold it up again, matching that seam, okay, and then pressing it. And that's the wonderful thing about a seam gauge, is that arrow slides so you can lock it into place. And so then I know that as I go down, okay, that looks perfect. Let me press it into place. So again, we're then going to go all the way around the circumference of the skirt. And at this second pressing, this is where you can hold it in place with your pins to get it ready for hand stitching. I don't know if you can see my thread, but we're basically going to take just a little bit of this fabric right on the edge of that seam, and then we're going to take just a little bit right on the edge of this fabric, okay? And then we're going to pull our needle through, and we're going to repeat the process. So right along that edge on the underneath fabric, this, scooping up a little bit, and then right on the edge of this fabric, okay? Now, a lot of people are just like, oh, I have to hand sew. What I do is I create it as an event that is a treat. So I'm gonna show you. I have my computer here, and I am gonna put on one of my favorite shows, because it's gonna take me about an hour to hem this skirt, and then maybe about 20 minutes to hem the collar. So that's like almost a Hallmark movie without the commercials, or an episode and a half of Lark Rise to Candleford, which is one of my favorite shows. And you know, behind me I'll have a favorite drink. Right now I'm drinking apple cider, sometimes it's a special tea, And I always keep it on the kitchen counter behind me. I don't want it on the table near my garment because it's important we don't have any liquids or food around us, that our hands are clean when we're doing this hand stitching. And you know, I find it very soothing, this methodical stitching, and it makes me feel a closeness to my ancestors who came before me. You know, I think about my grandfather's mother. She was a seamstress, and there's actually been several seamstresses in my family. But really, you know, up until, maybe the 1960s was when we saw women entering into the workforce, and there just wasn't time for them to clothe their families with homemade garments. Everybody made their own clothes, or they hired a dressmaker. You know, ready-to-wear fashion, it was available, but not like it is today. And people took better care of their clothes. Fabric was expensive, and then, you know, you think about the time invested to create this garment. By the time I'm finished, you know, I still have to do buttons and buttonholes. This is a 20-hour dress, so you will want to care for it, hand it down. So I'm just gonna keep hand stitching, taking that little bit of fabric on this side, right on the edge where the two meet, and picking up a little bit more of this fabric. And on a skirt hem, I usually separate my stitches by about 1/2 inch around the collar, because it's curved and there's a little bit more of a pull, and it's an area that meets your skin where there's going to be more wear and tear. I might separate my stitches every 1/4 inch. So I'm going to keep going. So I finished hand sewing both the collar and hem of the dress, and now we are ready to install the buttonholes. It's the last step of the dress. And so the buttonholes will go on the left-hand side, and where the extension is over here, that's where the buttons will go. And I have selected this tiny pearlized red shank button. So just kind of see that. This is the attachment that I use for my machine. And so I just open it up, slide in the button, and that tells my machine how big of a buttonhole it needs to make. So I take off my regular sewing foot, and then I attach this, and we're already threaded. And then on my machine, I just select the buttonhole attachment. That is one of the selections. And you kind of see all of my pins. That's where I want my buttonholes to go. Now, just as some extra insurance, I want to check the sizing on the buttonholes. So I don't want to do it on my garment. I'm going to get a scrap of fabric Gonna slide my scrap fabric underneath the attachment and put the foot down, and then for my machine I have to make sure that this lever is down, and then it is an automatic buttonholer. You just wait until it beeps, and you lift it up, and that's what it looks like. And then how I open up my buttonholes is I kind of take the pointy part of my snips and I run it through, and then I just fold it in half, and that opens up my buttonhole. So I'm gonna make several of these now. I think there's a total of 9. So we'll preserve the battery. I finished sewing on the buttons, and now I'm gonna give the dress one final pressing. So this is probably a good time to end this week's video. Next week we'll be having the reveal as to what the dress looks like on. And in week 4, I'm going to be sharing a very special dress that I created with the same pattern, inspired by the television show Little House on the Prairie. So be sure to come back. Hit the subscribe button in the lower corner, and as always, I appreciate your comments, and the thumbs up button is right down there. There is an accompanying post on my website, which is also linked below down in the description box. Have a great day. Now last week in the first, and there's our Grace.